Hi, I'm Todaro. So to engage is to grab our attention, snapping us into the moment. And I argue that we need these types of disruptions that Megan just talked about because we're all really well rehearsed. And what I mean by that is we know what to expect in our environments, our relationships, and our interactions. So instead of genuinely engaging in new scenarios, oftentimes we just go through the motions. But if we have so many of these hardwired routines, then there's an incredible opportunity to start leveraging them for more purposeful and engaging interactions. It just requires the proper reframing. So to explore this theory of reframing our shared routines for more specific ends, I turned to one of our longest running social traditions filled to the brim with social scripts: dinner parties. So why dining? Around the table is where we begin to develop and really codify so much of our social etiquette. And it's an incredible baseline that we all share, making this environment accessible to everyone. But most importantly, dining locates us within a framework of prefigured actions, such as how much one should talk, what the proper utensils are to use, and what are the proper rules for engagement. But dining is also a great corollary to how we function as social beings. So you have a bunch of people sitting around for a set length of time, talking and eating food, which is really not that different from how we typically get things done in this world. You have a bunch of people sitting around talking, just no food. I'm going to walk you through 3 dining experiments that I hosted that really explore how we can leverage our common social routines and mental models and reposition them for more thoughtful social outcomes. So I'm sure you've all been at a dinner where a couple of the guests are just flapping at the mouth, and no matter how hard you try, you just can't get a word in edgewise. So to address this, I built a custom table, and I invited some friends to a meal. So it was 6 guests. All of the place settings were raised above a bit of water on the table. This is important. And all of the guests were unaware that this was a social experiment. And as they begin to start talking and eating, this happens. So every time each guest speaks, a bit of color is released into the water below the plate. And in this case, these 2 guys are talking the most. So using table as an interface, we're able to visualize this conversation in real time. And what happens out of this is a feedback loop. The guest behavior is being visualized live in the amount of color, and then this allows them to adapt to this new information present and choose to modify their behavior. This leverages the common understanding that owning the conversation at the table is inherently impolite. But by simply being able to see their behavior objectively in real time, the guests are allowed to make that judgment for themselves and possibly change that behavior. The table as an interface makes guests self-aware. Now imagine something like this at your next business meeting. So we just saw table as an interface, but what happens when you use it to create a shared goal? So for this experiment, I invited 2 guests to sit down to 2 equally balanced bowls of soup. So the till table is very literal. It's a dining experience that encourages guests to be highly aware of one another's activity. Whether it's in consumption or conversation, guests have to maintain a balance, otherwise they'll end up with a bowl of soup in their laps. So you'll see Tyler and Sarah here taking turns eating or staying in pace with one another as they catch up over lunch. So this table is an exercise in forced empathy. It gives guests a shared sense of purpose, and it's motivated by its user unfriendliness. So by working together, the guests are more engaged. And as an added benefit, this table is impossible to text at. So for my final experiment, I wanted to see if I could develop new rituals around dining that would build community amongst strangers, allowing them to discover one another through different means than just small talk. And did it work? Well, within 15 minutes of complete strangers meeting one another, this happens. They begin shooting each other in the face with wine. And so I hosted another dinner in the same manner, and it happened again, and again, and again. So let me tell you how this happened. I hosted 2 dinners titled the Non-Traditionalist Dinner. 4 strangers sit down to a 4-course meal, and they're all given a different bag of tools to be used as utensils. So each bag contains things like binder clips and popsicle sticks and rubber gloves and yes, even a squirt gun. And the challenge to the group was to find a way to consume each of their courses with a limited set of ordinary objects. And this was without any direction from me. So one of the sets of the objects present on the table were these 4 long wooden sticks. And in the first meal that I hosted, one of the guests, Francesca, she notices them. And she holds them up to the group and she proposes, why don't we break these, and turn them into chopsticks? And realizing that everyone is struggling at the meal, eventually they all consent and encourage her to do so. So once she breaks them in half, and they all realize that that's okay, everyone else follows and takes turns to make their own chopsticks. And this may not seem like a big deal, but what comes out of this is an incredible model that this entire experience grows from. It's a problem-solving model. You have a guest presenting an object with an idea that can solve a problem. The others evolve it, they adopt it, or they deny it. And then they all eventually come to a consensus. And what this does is it frames each guest as having a role to help the collective. So rather getting to know one another through the means of what do you do for a living, guests are getting familiar with one another through the merits of their ideas. And from this, you start to see incredibly beautiful things emerge. Guests begin sharing the responsibility of generating ideas, and then this snowballs. Tools that are being built begin to look familiar, and then evolve. So in this case, on the far left, you see an initial idea, which is then adopted and modified by another guest in the middle, and then again adopted and modified by another guest on the right. Now these are all adaptations of plates made of model magic. And over 4 courses, by design, each course was becoming more challenging to eat than the previous one. Guests had to renegotiate how to solve each of the new challenges that arose in the meal. So guests start doing this by making new objects that were fitting for the food being served, or in many cases, lending objects to one another. This is Anna, and she eventually gave a glove to David, who needed something to eat the salad with. And subsequently, this variation of play and sort of lending and making and building, it leads to relaxed formalities. So people really start opening up with one another. And then all of the guests are in a really vulnerable state. I mean, you're asking to sit down and do weird things with strangers. And so guests negotiating these vulnerabilities with one another builds an incredible foundation of trust. So let me tell you a story. This is Gabrielle. She's awesome. But she has this big thing about cleanliness. And right now she's struggling a lot because the table looks like this. And earlier in the meal, the team constructed this incredible hookah straw mechanism for the box of wine that was present on the table, just for the sole purpose of drinking faster. And they were all really excited about it. But these are all strangers, and so Gabrielle would prefer not to share the drinking hose. And she voices this concern casually, and the group steps up. So after building and playing with a bunch of tools and trying things out, Justin eventually fashions this mouthpiece out of one of the ends of his eyedroppers by breaking it in half, which is just brilliant. And the problem is solved. But even more so than this idea gets adopted and evolved another time, and now Alex is feeling better too. So you remember the problem-solving model I talked about earlier after the guests made the chopsticks. This is how the second meal came to that conclusion. This is the light bulb moment, the great aha into immediate action. So guests felt like they beat the expectation of what they were supposed to do or how to behave. There was no directives, there was no user flow or site path. It was an emergent environment. And guests were actively rewarded by themselves and one another for employing uninhibited creativity and experimentation. So let's recap. By having very simple constraints at this dinner party, guests had the agency to be designers of their own experience, leading to playful, curious, and authentic reactions. And then guests were unified by common goals, and they relied on one another for collaboration. And this creates an environment that reinforces empathy, trust, and community building. So these experiments and others have allowed me to create a model that applies to so much more than just hosting interesting and good dinner parties. It is a process to begin unlocking us as social beings and to illustrate our behaviors and build mutual trust. So this is what it looks like. From the color table, we start to learn that you have to exaggerate what you want to influence. And then with the tilt table, we see the benefit of presenting challenges for guests to overcome. And to give guests agency, we have to anticipate and design for multiple outcomes. And then it's important to remove hierarchy and distribute the opportunities for guests to contribute ideas and emotions equally. And then once they're set, have people exchange ideas and build together. And then once they have, give them room to learn from their actions, try again, and build it better. And when I say build, I don't mean that it always has to be physical objects. We can build relationships, we can build connections, we can build context. So this is simple. It reinforces positivity. And this model can be utilized in any space that could benefit from better relationships between people. This is a proposition. The design of interactions comes in many shapes and forms, and when applied in familiar spaces, we can free ourselves of the rote and really start to engage. It's applying design to something seemingly established and changing it ever so slightly to open up an incredible amount of potential. By taking what's familiar and intentionally deconstructing it, we are able to learn many valuable lessons about ourselves and one another. Cheers.